So I grew up in Germany to Polish parents who had been raised during communist times, and I remember, my parents, friends and relations sitting around the kitchen table and telling these jokes about communism, which I didn't really understand. I didn't understand them because they often made reference to some obscure Polish political figure of the 1960s, and I also didn't really make sense of them because they had this sort of sense of political hopelessness and helplessness that, having the luck to grow up in a liberal democracy, I couldn't quite relate to. But I've been thinking back to one of those jokes quite a bit over the last couple of years, and I want to share it with you. It's relatively straightforward. A man walks home from work late at night in the Soviet Union. He's nearly back at home when, off in the distance, he sees another guy, visibly completely drunk, throwing up into the gutter. And as soon as he sees him, he puts a big smile on his face. He walks over there, he puts his hands on his shoulders, and he says, "I completely agree with your political analysis, comrade." So you can imagine why I've been thinking back to this joke over the last couple of years. There's a lot of reason, really. When you look at the headlines, you see the election in Turkey just a couple of days ago, in which a country which 15, 20 years ago looked like it was really on the way towards becoming a vibrant, stable democracy, has essentially formally become a dictatorship. It was a sham election which was not free and fair, which gives President Recep Erdogan nearly unlimited powers in the country. We saw an election in Italy a few months before that, in which populist parties of the left, more or less, some sort of slightly politically incoherent party by the name of the Five Star Movement, and a far-right populist party, the League, have cumulatively gotten nearly 60% of the vote, formed a strange left-right coalition to govern. You saw before that the re-election of Viktor Orban, another politician who had been democratically elected but then went on to dominate the media and the courts and the electoral commission and to gerrymander the political system and to actually potentially falsify parts of the election, re-elected for another term and seemingly entrenched in power there. And of course we see all of the political turmoil here in the United States, the coarsening of our political discourse, and even if one were not to take sides in any way, the deep institutional crisis that we see. And so all of that has me very worried. And as a political scientist, I think about it from the frame of the two basic assumptions to which virtually everybody in the field would have subscribed as recently as 2 years ago. The first of these assumptions is that there's a certain point at which liberal democracies are stable. So we always knew that there were some poor countries in which it was difficult for democracies to consolidate, that you might have democracy for a few years in a country like Kenya, and right now we're seeing that democracy slip, and that's very concerning and very worrying. Kenya is an important country with lots of people. But that wouldn't have surprised political scientists. They knew that in poor countries, in countries that don't have a deep democratic tradition, democracies would come and sometimes they would slip again. That wouldn't be surprising to them. We knew that there were some affluent countries which might never make the transition to democracy. So China doesn't look like it's about to become a democracy. That wouldn't have surprised political scientists 2 or 5 or 20 years ago either. But there is something that really would have upended their expectations, that has upended their expectations. Because not just Francis Fukuyama in his famous thesis of the end of history, but also political scientists who are far too close to the numbers and far too averse to nice phrases to have ever coined a term like the end of history, argued in the 1990s that once a country had had more than 2 changes of government for free and fair elections, once it had a GDP per capita of about $14,000, it was safe. if you counted up each country in each year where there was a democracy, there wasn't a single case of a democracy that fell into this category which had collapsed. And that gave rise to this really optimistic, basic idea of a future, because it meant that there was a huge swath of the world, in North America and Western Europe and Australia and Japan and perhaps even South Korea and so on and so forth, where we could take the future of liberal democracy for granted. And over time, we would add other countries. As other countries became more wealthy, as some wealthy countries transitioned to democracy, they too would be added to the sphere of democracies. And so the future looked bright. Well, I'm starting to think that this assumption was deeply wrong. The first reason for that is that political scientists believe that when democracies are stable in that kind of way, we should see certain correlates of it. Democracy would become the only game in town in those places, and that meant at the very least that most people gave huge importance to democracy. Very few people were open to authoritarian alternatives to democracy, and perhaps most importantly, there weren't any political parties and movements that had real power but didn't accept the basic rules and norms of democracy. And in my work, I show that none of these things are true anymore for every country in the supposedly stable region of affluent, long-standing liberal democracies. In many of them, 1, 2, 3 of those indicators are no longer the case. So let me briefly talk you through that. When you look at the United States and you ask older citizens born in the 1930s and 1940s how important it is to them to live in a democracy, over 2/3 say 10 out of 10, really important. When you ask millennials born since 1980, less than 1/3 do. Even when you ask about straightforward alternatives to democracy, the developments are really worrying, and not just among the young. 20 years ago, 1 in 16 Americans said that army rule is a good system of government. Now it's 1 in 6. Among young and affluent Americans, it's actually gone from 6 to 35%, nearly a 6-fold increase in the span of some 20 years. And this isn't just a story about Americans. Unfortunately, when you look at many Western European countries, you get similar figures. So take the following question. What do you think about a ruler? So how do you like the idea of a strong ruler who doesn't have to bother with parliament or elections? Right? Somebody who doesn't have to bother with parliament or elections. That's quite clearly not a democratic system. Well, in Germany, where I grew up, 1 in 6 people answered that question in the affirmative 20 years ago. Now it's 1 in 3. In France and the United Kingdom, it used to be 1 in 4. Now it's 1 in 2. Every second Frenchman, every second Brit who says, yeah, the idea of a strong ruler who doesn't really have to bother with parliament and elections, that's a good thing. And we see that reflected in the actual voting data as well. This was just the way that people answer these odd questions that, strange social scientists like me ask people. You might say, well, perhaps they're just having a laugh, or perhaps they're not really understanding what this is about. But here's the point. You see populist political parties who express exactly that ambition do better and better. Parties that do say, you know what, the political system is so corrupt, it's so inefficient, there's all of these independent institutions and roadblock to expressing the real will of the people. We just need to put all of those aside, give me a little bit more power and I'll fix it. That to me is the definition of a populist party. It can be on the political right, it can be on the political left. And in my work with colleagues, I have tracked how they have fared over the last 25 years. You go back to the year 2000 in Europe, the average vote share is about 8% in each country. Now it is well over 25%. Populists used to be in government in about 7 countries, usually as a minority partner. Now they are in government in 15 countries in Europe, often as the senior partner in the government, or the whole government being constituted by populists. Winston Churchill, as you may remember, held a very famous speech about the Iron Curtain descending over post-war Europe from Stettin in the Baltic all the way to Trieste in the Adriatic. Well, today you can drive along that Iron Curtain. You can drive from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, and you can continue to the left down to Bari, or you can continue to the right down to Athens, and you will never leave a country ruled by populists. There's a populist belt all across the center of Europe. All right. So what I want to do today is to describe the nature of this development, the nature of our political system and how it has transformed and deformed over the past years. I then want to say a little bit about the causes of these developments, and then at the end just very quickly start to tell you what some of the things are that we can do to remedy them, to save the political system that we care about. All right. So the political system that we care about, that's a good phrase. What is a political system that we care about? What is our political system? Why should we care about it? Well, I would argue that we live in a liberal democracy. And let me be very clear, when I say liberal here, I don't mean liberal, moderate, conservative in the kind of ideological sense that we sometimes talk about in the United States. I mean the classical philosophical term of liberal. And on that metric, I would argue that George W. Bush was as much a liberal as Barack Obama, and Ronald Reagan as much as Bill Clinton. So bear in mind when I say the word liberal, I don't mean Democrat, Republican, right? So our political system is a liberal democracy. And what that means is that it tries to fulfill two ambitions at the same time. The first ambition, the liberal one, is that it gives us individual freedom. That we live in a political system in which I decide what I say or don't say, which God I worship or not worship, whom I'm in a relationship with or not, right? And in order to have that individual freedom, we need to have certain kinds of social institutions. We need to have individual minority rights, the sort of stuff that's in the Bill of Rights. We also need to have the separation of powers and the rule of law. Because if the powerful guy, whether it's a prime minister or a president or a governor, can say, hey, I'm really offended by what you said, so I'm going to throw you in jail, I'm not going to feel free. So we need institutions to make sure that judges can step in and say, no, you don't get to throw that guy in jail just because you don't like what he said, right? All right. But that's not the only ambition we have, right? We live in a liberal democracy. We also promise people that we have some amount of collective self-rule. That there isn't a dictator or a priest or an imam or a monarch or a general who gets to tell us what laws we pass and what our future looks like, but rather we collectively determine what we do, right? All right. Now, the second big assumption that political scientists had for a long time is that these two aspirations of our political systems, these two basic elements, naturally go together. That once a system is liberal and democratic, these two things hold each other in place. And while I do think that you need one for the other to work, I fear that each can start to slide, and when one starts to slide, the other starts to go away as well. Liberalism and democracy can divorce, giving rise to two kinds of political systems. And I think that's what's happened over the last decades. I think for a long time, the democratic element has started to slip. So for a long time, we've had a system that I would describe as rights, as rights without democracy, or, this is a slightly ugly phrase, a kind of undemocratic liberalism. So what I mean by that is that with some obvious exceptions, especially concerning certain minorities, but by and large, we've been relatively good at following the rule of law. We've been relatively good at protecting individual rights. But we haven't been terribly good at translating popular views into public policies. In part because our legislatures, Congress in the United States, haven't been terribly responsive to what people actually want, which has something to do with the role of money in politics, which has something to do with the revolving door between lobbyists and legislators, which has something to do with the kind of slightly separate milieu in which lawmakers operate, who have to spend 50% of their time fundraising, so by the time it comes to vote on a particular bill, it's not necessarily that they're voting against their conscience, but it's that they understand the interests of the donors much better than the interests of the constituents. Right? There's also a second reason why we've ended up in a system of undemocratic liberalism or rights without democracy, which is not that our Congress isn't responsive enough to our views, but also at the same time that Congress actually makes fewer and fewer of the most important decisions in our society. But if you look at the rise of all of these other kinds of institutions, they've taken over a lot of power from Congress. When you think about the rise of independent central banks that are more independent, more powerful than they used to be, the rise of independent judicial institutions like the Supreme Court, which determined more and more questions through judicial review. When you think about the rise of independent agencies, from the Environmental Protection Agency to the Consumer Protection Bureau and so on and so forth, when you think of international trade treaties, when you think of international institutions and organizations, and take all of those things together, a lot of the most important decisions in our society are actually taken by these independent institutions now. All right. Now, sometimes these do good work, by the way. Some of the populists say, let's just abolish those. They're just a conspiracy against the people, get rid of them and everything is fine. I think that understates the problem, because a lot of these institutions are needed. We need complicated institutions in order to keep our power plant safe, staffed by experts, relatively independent from the legislature. We need international organization, international cooperation to deal with challenges like climate change. Right? If each country goes it on their own, we're not going to effectively tackle it because it's a global problem. So we need that kind of international cooperation. And yet it undermines your ability and mine to feel like we actually decide what's happening to us. So this is a deep dilemma to which there's no easy answer. Now there's one set of people who do give an easy answer to it, and that's the populists. They say, well, all of these institutions, all of the political elites are just corrupt and self-serving, they're a conspiracy against the people. Politics is at its heart really simple, right? If only good, well-intentioned people who care about you and me rather than those people over there were in power, everything would be solved. All right. Well, the heart of that claim is that they alone stand for the people. It's normal in politics to say we have strong disagreements. I really want you to vote for me because I have better policy ideas. I'm going to make the country better. My opponent is going to make the country worse. That's relatively ordinary in politics. But what's special about a lot of these populists is that they say, I alone stand for the people. And the people on the other side of the political spectrum aren't just wrong or stupid. They are bad. They are illegitimate. Because anybody who disagrees with me is illegitimate. Right? I alone am the voice of the people. That's what's dangerous about the populists. Because in a democracy, you need to be able to say, I really want to win, I think you're really wrong, but you know you're legitimate too. And if you win, I'll let you rule for 4 years. And then I have another chance of beating you. And if I win, I'm going to rule, I'm going to put in my policies, but I will protect your ability to beat me in 4 years. Once that breaks down, because you don't think of a political opposition as legitimate anymore, you're in really big trouble. Okay, so what happens when these kinds of populists who say, I alone can fix it, get into government? Well, sometimes they're open-hearted enough to admit that they might not be able to deliver on some of their promises. I'm thinking of a certain person who once he was in office said, who knew that things could be so complicated? Who knew that healthcare could be so complicated? But of course, that's not, they might on a strange, frank moment admit that, but most of the time that's not what they do. Most of the time what they do is to say, why have I not delivered for you yet? Why haven't I managed to transform the country overnight, which is impossible to do, by the way? Well, it's because the opposition are traitors. It's because the judges who rule some of the things I do to be unconstitutional are enemies of the people. It's because the media is all fake news and needs to be suppressed, and so on and so forth. So you see precisely that because of the basic logic of populism, it pushes them towards victimizing minorities and towards delegitimizing independent institutions and the political opposition. And that's what's so dangerous about these populists. Now, what that gives rise to is the analog. If we had a system of rights without democracy earlier, what this gives rise to is a system of democracy without rights, a system of illiberal democracy. So let me give you an example. There was a referendum in Switzerland some 8 years ago in which the Swiss people were asked to vote on whether or not we should forbid the building of minarets, the towers from which the call to prayer is traditionally done adjacent to mosques. And 58% of Swiss people did vote to outlaw any minarets being built in Switzerland. As a result, the Swiss constitution now reads, and I quote, and if you listen carefully, you'll notice that there's a little contradiction there. There's freedom of religion in Switzerland, full stop. The building of minarets is forbidden, full stop. Doesn't make much sense. Now, a lot of papers in Switzerland and France and Germany and the United States condemned this vote as undemocratic. And I think that that's a confusion of terms. I think it's deeply illiberal. It obviously abridges the rights of the biggest religious minority in the country. I personally find it very troubling, but it's not undemocratic. A majority of people voted for it. If democracy means translating popular views into public policy, it's weird to call this undemocratic. What it is illiberal. It goes against individual rights. In a certain kind of way, it goes against the rule of law, right? And so what we see in countries like Hungary is that people come in. At the beginning, they do actually represent the will of a lot of people, often the will of a majority. They might make politics a little bit more responsive to people in the early stages, but they also make the institutions deeply illiberal. They attack the rule of law because they fire any judge they don't like and put their own people in place. Right? They attack minorities. They quash the freedom of the press. They make it hard for the opposition to operate. In Hungary, for example, the Electoral Commission, which is dominated by Orban's cronies, gave huge fines for all opposition parties on very spurious grounds and somehow declined to investigate the ruling party for the same reasons. Right? Now, what you get there over time is that you can go from a liberal democracy to an illiberal democracy to an electoral dictatorship. You go from a system which still is meaningfully democratic but violates the rights of individuals in many ways, to a system in which you might have sham elections like you did in Turkey a couple of days ago, but they are so unfair. It is so hard for the opposition to actually win because, say, as happened in Turkey, one of the opposition candidates has to campaign from jail. That it's no longer a democracy in any meaningful sense. All right. Hungary is a really interesting case. You might think of it as a relatively minor election, a small country in Europe where the government was re-elected for the third time. But it is what my parents would have been taught in their communist high schools. It has world historical significance. That's a nice Marxist phrase. Which is to say that it really disproves one of the basic theories that we had. Because Hungary does have more than $14,000 GDP per capita. It has had many more than 2 changes of government for free and fair elections. And yet this country in the heart of Europe, as a member of the European Union, at this point in my mind is no longer a democracy. That comforting theory from the 1990s has been proven wrong in this case. And that means that similar things could happen in other countries too. All right. So why is all of this happening? Why are we seeing this set of developments in so many different places at the same time, a similar kind of crop of populist politicians rising? Well, to answer this question, I hope you'll indulge me here for a minute. I want to tell you a story about a chicken. And it's the kind of chicken that they like to eat here in Aspen, which is to say that it's organic and it gets to run around on a farm and it has a happy life and all those kinds of things. But one day, the other animals on the farm warn it and say, be careful, the farmer only seems to be nice, one day he's going to come and kill you. And the chicken says, what on earth are you talking about? Every day of my life, a farmer has fed me and muttered some encouraging words to me. Why should things suddenly be so different? Well, Bertrand Russell writes, whom I'm stealing the story from, one day the farmer does wring the chicken's neck, demonstrating that more sophisticated views as to the uniformity of causation would have been to the chicken's benefit. What does he mean by that? Well, what he means by that is that there's scope conditions in the social world. Right? As long as the chicken was too thin for the market, he had a reason to keep feeding it. Once it was fat enough to fetch a good price, he had a good reason to kill it. The scope conditions had changed. And I want to submit to you that to understand what is transformed in the state of our democracy, we have to ask a similar set of questions. We have to ask a chicken question. What has been true in the universe of stable democracies in the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s that is no longer true now? Why is it that they were so stable then and we're not so stable now? And we have to look beyond one country. One of the things that always strikes me is that when I give this talk in the United States, people say, well, what about these really local reasons? And when I give a talk in Germany, they say, well, what about those really local reasons? And they're very, very different reasons. But if the same thing is happening in the States and in Germany and in Italy and in Hungary, we should probably look for things that are happening in all of those places at the same time. Well, I think there's at least three of those. The first is a stagnation of living standards for ordinary citizens. In the United States, from 1945 to 1960, the living standard of the average American doubled. From 1960 to 1985, it doubled again. Since 1985, it's essentially been flat. It's essentially been stagnant. And that really changes how people talk and think about politics. Look, 30, 40 years ago, it's not as though people were saying, I love politicians. Washington, D.C. is the best place in the country. That wasn't the case. But they used to say, you know what? I'm twice as rich as my parents were, and my kids are probably going to be twice as rich as me. So let's give them the benefit of a doubt. Something seems to be working here, but sticking to their end of the deal. What people are saying now is, I've worked really hard all my life and don't have much to show for it. My kids are probably going to do worse than me, so let's throw some shit against the wall and see what sticks. How bad could things get? Right? Now, when you look at the voting data, it's not immediately obvious that the economic stuff matters. If somebody tells me how much money they make, it doesn't make it easy for me to predict, for example, whether they voted for Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. But there's a very strong economic and regional pattern to the vote for populists. So Donald Trump won over 2/3 of American counties, but just about 1/3 of America's GDP. He did much better in parts of a country where you've had very little recent economic investment, where there's fewer educated people, even where the share of jobs that might be automated away in the next 30 or 40 years is much higher. And you see the same regional pattern basically wherever you look. In Hungary, in Germany, in France, in Italy, it is the economically weak regions that elect populists. Now, there's a second reason as well, and there's been this big debate in the last 2 years. Is it the one thing or is it the other thing? Is it about the economy? Is it about cultural attitudes? And I think that's simplistic, because the world is not monocausal. If somebody falls in love with you, it's hopefully for more than one reason. And if somebody leaves you, it's probably because you've screwed up more than one time. Right? So these two things go together, they reinforce each other. And the second thing, obviously, is cultural. So when you look at most democracies in the world, they were founded with a strongly mono-ethnic and monocultural conception of themselves. You go back 30, 40, 50 years, you ask somebody in Sweden, in Italy, in Spain, what is it that makes a true member of your nation? What really makes somebody Swedish? The answer would have been relatively straightforward. Well, it's somebody who's ethnically descended from the same stock. We're sort of ethnic unity. And that wasn't ever exactly true, but that's certainly how people thought about it. Well, over the last 30, 40, 50 years, these countries have experienced mass migration. They have started to change their political conceptions, often their laws. In a country like Germany, it was impossible to become a German citizen in 1990 by anything other than descent or because you married a German. If you legally immigrated to a country and lived there for 40 years, you would still not be able to become a German. Well, that's changed, thankfully. Some of the social notions have changed as well. People have become more open to the idea that yes, of course, a German, a Swede can be brown or black, Muslim or Jewish or Hindu, but there's also a lot of people who are rebelling against that. And while we don't have to condone that, while we don't have to appreciate that, I do think we have to understand it. And there are ways to understanding it, right? I mean, imagine that you're a guy who's not the most accomplished person in the world, doesn't have the best job, doesn't get the most social respect. It was really tempting for them 30 or 40 years ago to say, well, at least I'm Swedish rather than Danish. Right? We Swedes are much better than those Danes. And at least I'm a member of the ethnic majority rather than one of those weird immigrants coming in from Turkey or whatever it is. Right? It gave people a real social status that gave something to them in their lives. Right? Well, now that immigrant from Turkey might be their boss or they might be representing them in parliament. And I welcome that, but as a social scientist, it doesn't surprise me that the people who have lost that status advantage, that unearned status advantage that being a member of a majority gave them, that's hard to bear. That's something that we really have to give up. Now, when you look at the United States and at Canada, the situation is both similar and different. It's different in the sense that these have obviously always been multi-ethnic societies, but it's similar in that they've always been multi-ethnic societies with a very strong racial and religious hierarchy, in which being a member of a particular group gave you strong advantages over others. And again, I think it's important to remember that we've actually come a very long way in overcoming that. I think there's no doubt that it's better to be a member of just about any ethnic, religious, sexual minority today in this country than it was 20 or 40 or 60 years ago. Perhaps not 2 years ago, but certainly 20 or 40 or 60 years ago, right? And I celebrate that, but again, as a social scientist, it doesn't surprise me that some of the people who have something to lose from that, who have something to give up from that, are rebelling against it. Right. So if you have the challenge of stagnating living standards and the kind of basic lack of trust that gives people in the political system, and if you have this unique historical experiment of trying to build an equal multi-ethnic society, and the resistance that inspires in people who have something to lose from that. The third really important element that explains what's going on is the rise of the internet and of social media. So 25 years ago, we had a structure of communication, and you have to bear with me here, that wasn't so different from what we saw 200 or 300 years ago. Now, that seems like a weird claim, because even 25 years ago, you would have been able to walk to the hotel bar here and see the World Cup live, pictures, sound, everything being transported from around the world. Obviously, that wasn't possible 200 years ago. But it was a structure of what I'd call one-to-many communication, which is to say that there were certain centers of communication geographically, places like New York and LA, but also socially. It was the owners and operators of radio stations, television stations, newspapers, who could sort of decide what you could say in society and what you couldn't. Now, over the last 25 years, two things have happened. First, the rise of the internet and of websites, which democratized one-to-many communication. Suddenly, it wasn't just somebody who had the capital for huge machinery who could print a newspaper and distribute it around the country. I could practically free of charge put up a website. And anybody with an internet access could come and access it. That's a very different kind of thing. But it was still difficult for people to find that website. Why would they go to joeblogs.com, which they didn't know about? They didn't know about the NewYorkTimes.com. So what happened in the second step is just as consequential. And that's the rise of social media, of many-to-many communication. Because suddenly, even if you only have 50 followers on Twitter, but you post a particularly cute video of your cat, or a particularly harrowing video of a police shooting, within a couple of hours, millions of people might see that video. Right? So anybody has now taken on the power of reaching lots and lots of people with a viral message. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It helps, to some degree, the democratic opposition in autocratic countries. It's much harder for the dictator to control what kind of information gets out there. It can often empower admirable people within our own societies who speak for marginalized groups or for new causes which the mainstream media may have ignored or may have just put to the side 25 years ago. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago with one of the survivors of the horrible shooting in Parkland, Florida. And whatever you think about gun control, I think you have to admire those 17, 18-year-old kids who have managed within a couple of weeks to become articulate, thoughtful voices for their political cause. And that's thanks to social media. That would not have happened without Twitter and so on and so forth. Right? So it has lots of good things, but it also has bad things. It also means that structurally, outsiders have narrowed the gap towards gatekeepers and insiders. And that means that hateful voices, which may have been more marginal 25 years ago, that means that liars who just want to spread completely made up information, who wouldn't have had as much of a purchase 25 years ago, can now have a real stake in our political system. And coming on top of the other things, coming on top of the economic frustration, coming on top of the fears that parts of the population have about cultural and demographic transformation, that makes for a really dangerous cocktail. Let me just very briefly say something about what we can do about this, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A, because I do really want to make sure that we get a real discussion. There's a tactical element and a strategic element to what we do about all of this. The tactical element is crucially important. What you see in places like Hungary and Poland and Turkey is that the first time that authoritarian populists are up for re-election, the opposition doesn't necessarily have an even shot at displacing them, but the playing field is still equal enough that they have a real chance. By the time that authoritarian populists are up for re-election the second or the third or the fourth time, the playing field has really tilted a lot. So even though there might be elections, it's basically impossible for the opposition to win. And so the first thing that we need to make sure is that populist parties don't win in countries where they're not yet in government, and that they are thrown out of government, or at least that the power is checked as quickly as possible in countries where they are. And that involves the opposition trying to unite. What we see over and over again is that populists are re-elected in places where the opposition fails to unite. It means campaigning for somebody, voting somebody who you might not love, if that is the person who has a commitment to the basic rules and norms of a political system that allow you hopefully to vote for somebody you like a little bit more 5 years from now. And it also means for moderate establishment parties to get their act together. To say that it's not just the populists who can offer a politics of change, which is usually extreme, you can also have a more sensible, a less ideologically extreme politics of change. Even the more moderate, the more establishment parties can actually offer real improvements that citizens are going to feel. So that's the tactical bit. But there's also a strategic bit. Because as I've been talking about, this is not just about one election, it's not just about one charismatic candidate, it's not about a one-off thing. It is about long-standing structural explanations. It's about the slow rise of populism because of real social transformations. And so we have to get at those social transformations. And the way to do that is to have economic policies that actually make citizens believe and feel that their lives can get better in the future. And there's a whole bunch of those that I talk about in my book. It is about fighting for an equal multi-ethnic society in which both minority groups and majority groups can feel like they have a fair seat at the table. And that, I think, has to go via a notion of inclusive patriotism, rather than writing off the idea of patriotism, as a lot of people have done, I think, especially on the left, and I certainly did that as a kid over the last years. I think it is to say we have to fight for what it means to be American. Obviously, everybody who lives in this country needs to be able to be American, irrespective of what their skin color is, irrespective of what their religion is. But we will use that, we will fight for that, not by saying being patriotic is bad, but by saying we're going to change what it means to be American, what it means to be patriotic. And finally, we have to deal with the rise of social media and so on, not by giving up on freedom of speech, not by restricting what people can say, but by actually shoring up the kinds of civic values and the kind of understanding of our political institutions that we need in order for people to come to their defense and to understand why certain kinds of speech and why certain modes of politics are dangerous. I'm struck, and this is the last thing I'll say before we go to Q&A, by the fact that, I teach political science at Harvard. if I said to my faculty colleagues that one of our core tasks as educators is to make sure that we transmit our basic political values from one generation to the next, to actually give people a deep appreciation of what liberal democracy is and why we should defend it, they would say that's not our task. Our task is to describe the world, perhaps to criticize it. It's not to be propagandists. But I don't want us to be propagandists. It's important for us to be very upfront about all the things that are wrong in our country. There's plenty of them. It's important that we give our students a sense of how they can go and fight to improve those injustices and so on. That's crucial. But they have to do that on the basis of an appreciation of why it is better right now to be a citizen of the United States or of France or of Sweden than of North Korea or Venezuela or Hungary or Turkey. They have to do that on a basis of a clear commitment to liberal democracy, to the aspiration that we want to build a political system in which each of us has individual liberty and in which all of us together get to rule ourselves. Thanks. So I think we have roaming mics if you want to start in the back row.
Hi, I was wondering if you notice any correlation between mean educational level in the countries of Germany, France, and Hungary, and whether that mean educational level has gotten less in the last 20 years, and whether that correlates to the demise of democracy, where in the U.S. 50% of the adults read it below an 8th grade level, and some people think that correlates.
Yeah, so, it depends from country to country. I think probably in a country like Hungary it's gone up because of the transition from communism and so on. But what's striking is that while the general level of education in the society hasn't necessarily gone down, in the United States many more people have gone to college now than 20, 30 or 40 years ago, the level of political knowledge has gone down drastically. And we know that from lots and lots of polls. I forget what percentage of Americans it is who could get a passing grade on a high school civics test. It is a depressingly small percentage. There's a great Atlantic article about this. A lot of people have shown that the time devoted to civics lessons in high school has more than halved over the last few decades. So this is something that is a failure of ours. We have given up on the insight that political thinkers have always had, from Plato to Aristotle, from Rousseau to the founding fathers. They all recognize that if you want a self-governing republic to be stable over time, you have to educate the citizenry, particularly about the political institutions and values. And every person in this room has a platform. All of you have ways to talk about this. All of you have ways to speak about this with your family members, with your children, grandchildren, nieces, nephews, and so on. So that's something we can all do a little bit of something about. Yeah. Oh, I think if you wait for the mic, I'm afraid there's always a little bit of a pause of suspense before the mic makes it to somebody.
Many of us are tremendously troubled by Trump's chipping away of democratic institutions. And many of us also believe that his populist agenda is based on a desire for financial gain and a huge ego trip. What specific recommendations would you have to stop him from pursuing this course? Because I know that political parties are trying to do something, but everybody seems to be like all over the place with no real direction, including a real message to bring him down, so to speak.
Yeah. So look, I haven't mentioned the name Donald Trump that much in this talk so far, and that's because I generally think that the problem goes beyond that geographically. We see very similar developments in lots of other countries, and the problem goes beyond one person in the United States. I don't think this is going to go away if one person goes away. And we've seen that in other countries. That once a populist leader is removed from office, they often spawn imitators, or they hand the baton down to family members and so on and so forth. In Italy in 2011, Silvio Berlusconi, who was a sort of proto-populist with a lot of similarities actually to Donald Trump, who had dominated the country's politics for about 25 years, stepped down from office, and there was huge celebrations. There was this impromptu, this sort of amateur choir and orchestra that came together impromptu to give a rendition of Handel's Hallelujah. Well, 7 years later, Berlusconi actually has a real stake of power in the political system again, but even more so, there's these two other populist parties that have just taken over, that have just exploded. And now form of government. So, populists are very tenacious, and this is not a problem that's going to go away. But I agree with you, and I'm going to show my cards here, that Donald Trump is a populist and that he's dangerous. He's dangerous because he has threatened to jail his political adversary. He's dangerous because during the campaign he has said that he might not accept the outcome of the election. He's dangerous because he threatens individual citizens of the United States whom he dislikes. He's dangerous because, as he did yesterday in a tweet, when a private company like Harley-Davidson takes an economic decision of which he disapproves, he says, I'm going to raise your taxes. Not the taxes of companies like you, not the taxes of companies that make this kind of economic decision. I'm going to use all the power I have to punish you. Now, we're not there yet. Any court would strike that down right now. But we've seen in other countries that starts to happen. We've already seen in this country that AT&T paid a bribe, essentially, to Michael Cohen. One of the biggest American corporations felt they needed to pay off the personal lawyer of a president in order to get fair treatment in one of their business dealings and proposed merger. So we've already gone quite a long way. And I think the business community, which is tempted, I think, to say, you know what, we like the tax cuts and business is going well and perhaps we don't love this guy, but everything seems to be fine, I think is underestimating how big an impact that has on economic performance in the long run. When you look at Russia and Turkey and Hungary, those are not innovating economies. They are not economies that are setting themselves up for the future, because they are economies in which what matters most is whether you are close to government. And that's never been the recipe for success for America, and it's not going to be good for American business or the American economy going forward. And I think that danger is underestimated. So, yes, I do think that Donald Trump is one of those authoritarian populists, and that's very dangerous. And what can we do about that? Well, I think two things. First, we need to beat him at the polls. Impeachment, to me, is a very suboptimal outcome. It may be that Mueller finds things that are so damning that it's right to initiate impeachment proceedings, where I have very real doubts that the Republican Party, in the way that it's unified around Trump, would ever vote for it. So I don't think we'll get to 67 senators. But it might be, if what Mueller finds is so shocking that he's clearly legally unfit for office, then we should probably initiate impeachment proceedings. But the way to exercise this from our political system is not to impeach him, it's to beat him in 47 states in 2020. The second thing, which is just as important, though, and I don't know how many of you went to the wonderful panel on Never Trump Republicans at the Belly Up a couple of days ago. It was a really great panel. Because the second thing is that, look, as a lot of you will have guessed, I'm on the moderate left, right? I'm not a right-winger. I'm not, and this is the word time I'm going to use conservative in a more political sense. I'm not a conservative on all kinds of social and economic and so on issues. But there's a lot of people in this country who are conservative, right? And for our political system to be healthy, they need a voice, right? But they need a voice that has constitutional values and respects our institutions and respects the FBI and respects the Department of Justice and respects the judges and so on and so forth. So the second thing we need to do after, hopefully, we beat Donald Trump, and that's not for me to do because I'm not on the right, but it is perhaps for some of the people in this room to do, is to reconstitute the Republican Party as a sane governing party with constitutional values. Because the problem is not that the right has won. The problem is that people who don't have a commitment to our basic democratic rules and norms has won. Lots of hands. Yes, over there.
Great, thank you very much. Just a question about the kind of fake news, obfuscation of truth, multiple narratives. Curious how you see that as a threat to liberal democracy, and if you see a path forward out of this complexity.
Yeah. Look, I do think that it is a real challenge, and obviously part of a real challenge is the way in which some of our adversaries are using our divisions and our susceptibility to fake news in order to influence our elections and so on and so forth. But I think the way to deal with that is both to build trust in the political system by actually having politicians who deliver on their promises and govern in a sensible way, and to teach people about the nature of the political system and the dangers it faces. It's not to go on a rampage of censorship. So a lot of European countries now are basically saying, if somebody posts a hateful post on Facebook, the executives of a company can be fined a lot of money. And that'll lead to Facebook censoring all kinds of things. And let me be clear about why I think that's a problem. I think that there are certain utterances that have no value. There are certain utterances that I would be glad if they were effectively expunged from the world. But I don't trust a political institution to make the decision for me about what those utterances are. And one of the things I always find odd about people who are quite comfortable with various forms of censorship is that even though they often recognize that they don't have power in the country right now, they somehow always assume that once it comes to censoring, they're going to be the ones making the decisions. But what if it's the guys on the other side who get to make the decisions, right? That is why I'm against those kinds of forms of censorship. So yeah, fake news is a real problem, but in the end, the way to deal with it is to build trust in our political institutions rather than to censor what people can say. I think we had a young democracy-hating millennial right over here. Now,
I hope not. So I thought it was interesting and kind of subtle point you were making about how a kind of rise in democratization with the news through social media or other outlets can actually have undemocratic results. And I guess the question is, do you think that a degree or certain kinds of more, let's say, centralized, undemocratic institutions are essential for maintaining democracy? Mm. And if so, how do you? I mean, it's a hard thought to explain, I think, to certain people. And how do you go about making the case for that reality?
Yeah, I mean, I think you put your finger on something that really is the most complicated question in all of this, right? So when I go back to what I was talking about with rise of our democracy, the way in which our political institutions aren't responsive, there's a bunch of these things which are in principle easy to solve. In practice, they're hard to solve, but in principle, it's easy to think about how you would stop congressmen from having to spend half of their time fundraising. Right? It's easy to think about how you stop the revolving door between lobbyists and legislators. In practice, in part because of Supreme Court jurisprudence, it's hard to do, but sort of we have an idea of what that world would look like. On the existing of all these independent institutions, it is a lot harder. Because as I was saying, a lot of them actually do important work. And so to abolish them would lead to worse outcomes, which would enrage people in other ways. But at the same time, their existence makes people say, well, I don't really have anything to say, and they kind of have a point. Right? So I would distinguish between two different kinds of independent institutions. There are independent institutions that we absolutely need because they are a guarantor of our future freedoms. Right? So you need independent courts, you need independent electoral commissions, you need the balance of power, separation of powers, because if we get rid of them, then the people might be able to go and run wild today, what the founding fathers would have called the tyranny of the majority, but we may not be able to displace the government tomorrow. So we're giving up our democratic rights tomorrow, right? So those things obviously have to stay in place. And that's why I'm so concerned, to get back to your question, when institutions like the FBI are being attacked. Right? This is not about one investigation. What happens if a president gets to direct the FBI at will and can say, anybody I dislike, I can go and throw in jail, right? That is really dangerous to our political institutions. But on the other hand, I do think that there are some parts where we can scale back independent institutions a little bit. Look, let me be honest. I told you, I'm sort of on the left. I like the Consumer Protection Bureau. I like the Environmental Protection Agency. I think in terms of the outcomes, they've had outcomes I've agreed with. But I actually think it would be sensible to scale their ambit back somewhat, return more power to Congress, if Congress hopefully would be a little bit more functional, and then hopefully get the same outcomes. I'm going to argue for those same outcomes in Congress, but I would rather that legislators make those decisions than those relatively insulated institutions, right? And not abolishing, but certainly restricting the ambit of some of those institutions may lead to some worse outcomes, but that's not going to lead to tyranny and the lack of a rule of law and so on, right? You don't need the EPA and the Consumer Protection Bureau for that. You do need the FBI and so on and so forth. A last question, yes, the lady up here, and you can wait for the microphone.
You talk about the
Oh, if you could wait for the microphone, sorry.
You talk about the importance of elections in checking the advance of authoritarians, but what happens when elections themselves are at risk, either by gerrymandering, voter restrictions, and Russian interference?
Well, you obviously have to fight for the integrity of elections as best you can. I think the decision on very partisan and narrow grounds of the Supreme Court a couple of days ago, which basically gives a green light to all kinds of forms of gerrymandering, is deeply concerning. It's deeply concerning that we live in a country in which, you know, if you live in a heavily African-American neighborhood, the time it'll take you to vote is 4 or 5 times longer than in neighboring suburban areas, right? So these things are real challenges. So you have to do 2 things. You have to do your best to win and fight on the slightly uneven playing field, because that's the best playing field you've got. And then you have to use your powers of persuasion, your political power, to do everything you can to even the playing field again. Right? Now, I want to. I know that sometimes when I give these talks, people come out and hopefully they enjoyed it and they thought it was a good talk, but they also tell me that was really depressing. So I hope I haven't depressed you this early in the morning on this wonderful day. You can go and bask in the sun a little bit if I have. But I just want to say that I am not actually depressed by all of this. In fact, I'm heartened and energized by it in a certain kind of way. Which is to say that 20, 25 years ago, I knew that politics mattered. I knew that there was all kinds of important questions about whether our society would be better or worse, more dynamic or less dynamic, more or less just, that hinged on political questions. But I also thought that the influence we might have, the kind of things that are up to us collectively, are relatively narrow, because we sort of know we're always going to be a democracy and so on and so forth. Right? Well, now I think, I certainly believe, and I hope some of you agree with that diagnosis, that we live in more existential times, that actually what we're doing is defending the very basics of our political system. And that's scary, because I can't promise you a happy end. I can't promise you the United States, where we've taken the first and the second and the third step that people in Hungary and Turkey have taken over the last years. And we may take the 9th and 10th step as well and end up like those countries. So I can't promise you a happy end, and that is scary. But I also think that it is up to us, that we still have freedoms that the citizens of a lot of those countries don't. That the playing field is not exactly even, but we do have a chance of doing the right thing. And so this energizes me. It means that we can actually have a huge effect of our actions. Now, I went to a great talk by Amos Oz about half a year ago, and he had this great image that there's a big fire burning out there in the world. That, well, it can feel really helpless. Each of us as an individual only have a little glass of water, and what are we going to be able to do about the fire? But despite the early hour, there's lots of you in this room here. And there's a bunch who are going to be watching this on video, and there's a bunch of people you know. And if all of us take our glass of water and put it on the fire, then together we might just be able to put it out. And I think it's our duty to try and do that as best we can. Thanks.